The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
Florida's Space Coast Office of Tourism, representing destinations from Titusville to Cocoa Beach to Melbourne Beach. The Space Coast has a diverse 72 miles of beach, including surf towns and sea turtle nests. We have inspiring attractions, including the Kennedy Space Center, Brevard Museum of History and Natural Science, and the Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge. More information is available at www.visitspacecoast.com.
and by the Department of State Division of Cultural Affairs, the Florida Council of Arts and Culture, and the state of Florida. Welcome to Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. I'm Ben Brotemarkle. The Florida Historic Capitol building has been restored to its 1902 appearance. Since 1982, the building has been a museum with exhibits documenting the history of Florida government from the Territorial Period to the present.
Oh, it's a magnificent museum. It's really a focal point of people visiting Tallahassee. In fact, time and time again, people don't even, the new Capitol building is magnificent, but it's just it looks like a tall condominium. And there are beautiful interior parts of it, the legislative chambers, but they say they enjoy going and seeing the historic Capitol. And what the legislature has done, they've done a great job. They've restored it again, so there were a few minor things had to be done, but we've created a wonderful museum, and you can learn about the legislature, the executive, and even the Supreme Court. Students come in and use the facilities for debate societies. They will bring student classes from all over North Florida and bring them in and have them participate as legislators. But it's a real living historical museum.
Within the building, there are thematic exhibits in the rooms off the corridors, and then there are 4 historic chambers that you can visit: the Governor's Suite, the Supreme Court, and the House and Senate chambers. Those chambers look exactly as they did in 1902, and that's one of the most important reasons that the 1902 version of the Capitol building was selected for this restoration, is that all 3 branches of Florida's government were housed in this building at that point.
Bob Williams sent out letters, my director of the Division of Archives and History Record Management. He sent out letters and to all of his friends throughout Florida, primarily in the Panhandle and things like this, just saying, do you have any remembrances? Do you go back into your attics, look into those old pieces of luggage and storage boxes? And suddenly we had pictures of a former governor lying in state at the Capitol, at the bottom of the stairway. We had a desk appeared which showed what the desks were like. We had a drawing of the Florida Supreme Court. So all of a sudden, all this material became available, and Bob came into my office and said, Bruce, we can have the 1902, we can do the 1902 Capitol. We can preserve it because we have sufficient information to really reconstruct it from a historically accurate basis, still used in the old walls and things like that.
The Governor's Suite of rooms is downstairs, and it is from the 1902. It's very heavily furnished, so it's really fun because you can see in that moment how Florida's government operated. Really, you feel the work that was being done in that space, and so people really enjoy it. And in that space as well, we have prints of the portraits of the governors, and I think people just enjoy seeing all the different folks over the years that led this state.
I think what we have now with the old Capitol, it's almost the front door to the new Capitol, and it is one of the important, as is the center here in Cocoa, centers of Florida history.
Items on display at the Florida Historic Capitol Museum include a pair of shoes worn by Governor Lawton Chiles as he literally walked the entire length of Florida during his 1970 campaign for the U.S. Senate, the roll-top desk of William Sherman Jennings, who was governor of Florida from 1901 to 1905, and an infamous butterfly ballot from the controversial 2000 U.S. presidential election. People who visit the museum enjoy different exhibits.
For adults, it seems to be Election 2000. We get tons of people who want to see items related to that. I think for most folks, either they voted in the election or were growing up and hearing about the election, so they feel very connected to that particular issue. And it was a moment when Florida, but also this building, really kind of took center stage. You know, we were the backdrop of a lot of the newscasts and the coverage related to that event. So people want to see the hanging chads, they want to see the ballot, and we have those in this building. We also have a howitzer cannon, which used to sit on the exterior of the building on the front steps, and when we take children's groups through, they hit the doorway of that exhibit and they just ooh and ah over it. And it's a Civil War era cannon, and it wasn't used in battle but was located very close to battle. And it's a real cannon, that's what we tell the kiddos, and they really do love it.
Visitors to the Florida Historic Capitol Museum can see the rooms where each branch of Florida government functioned. Mary Adkins, author of the book Making Modern Florida, How the Spirit of Reform Shaped a New State Constitution, imagines the new Constitution being debated in the Senate chamber.
Oh, yes, I really do. I went there and stood in the Senate chamber and said, you know, Chesterfield Smith would have been right up there. Here's the well where people would go if they wanted to talk about something or put forth an amendment. Here's where the court reporter would be. It was really neat to see it. And I was able to add some of the details to my book, too. So the 1978 Constitution Revision Commission, actually, the new Capitol was finished while they were meeting, so they met partly in one and partly in the other.
Over the years, there was on this site or near this site a log cabin building in the initial territorial government. And then there had been some investment to build a larger sort of official capitol building here on the site. There was a little bit of money that was put into it by Congress, and some money that was also raised by selling off portions of Tallahassee, the land in Tallahassee, essentially to raise funds. And when they did that, they were able to expand into an eventual 3-story building that was about 24,000 square feet, that was completed just about in time for the 1845 statehood of Florida. And at that point, 24,000 square feet, if you're trying to picture how big that would be, it's about half the size of a standard Publix store, something that's familiar to all of us. And basically, it's all of Florida's government housed within this building. But within just a number of years, it's already too small for a growing government with a growing state, and there's a push to keep expanding over the years. The next major thing that happens is that 1890, there's a little cupola that's put on the top of the building. That's really the only added feature until that big 1902 expansion happens here in the building, and that's led by Governor William S. Jennings, who had them add the features like electricity. We had modern floors put in, which are linoleum floors that you see throughout the building. They put the dome on the top of the building. It really starts to become a building that looks more like what you would picture for an official government building, the sort of image that we think of when we think of government.
Before, you had some Greek columns in the front. It's basically a rectangular building. And so what happened is we got our first modern capital, you might say. The state began to expand, and they hired Clutho, an architect, who had designed another state capitol building, but we ended up with our large state capitol dome, sort of what you have in Washington, but what we have is smaller version, much smaller version in Tallahassee. And we added on wings, and the building became this big white monumental building, Greco-Roman building.
It's no accident that Greco-Roman architecture is used for the governmental buildings in Washington, D.C., as well as state government buildings across the country, including Florida. The architectural style was created in ancient Greece, home of the first successful democracy in Western culture, and expanded by the Roman Empire, home of the first successful republic. The founders of the United States of America saw the Greco-Roman architecture as a physical symbol of the ideals of the representative democracy they were creating. That architectural style was also emulated on the state level, including the Florida Historic State Capitol.
There's 2 additional wings that are added The reason why only one's added in the 1930s and then the second one is added in the 1940s is that the war happens and, frankly, the state runs out of money. And so once the war is over, the final expansion occurs and the building reaches its largest point. And it remains at that size until the 1970s. Now, there are significant changes that happen within the building from that 1940s period and on. They start dividing floors in half and putting offices in random spaces. You hear stories from people who worked in the building up until the 1970s of offices that are within offices. You go up and you go down in order to get into a room. Very unusual things, but you're just trying to make do with the space that you have, and that's what they were doing.
They added a wing to the west, which housed a new House of Representatives, and a wing that extended out to the east. Architecturally, people felt that it gave more balance to the dome, which tended to be dominant. But once again, within 2 decades, the state capitol building was totally overwhelmed as far as its needs. The 1902 version is very unique because under its roof, you had all 3 branches of government. You had not only the governor and the legislature, you also had the Florida Supreme Court. And even then, they were able to rent out some basement rooms to some private entities. But then suddenly, almost within 5 years, they had to move the Supreme Court out. And as Florida's population grew and the economy became more diverse, the capital government had to grow along with it.
Throughout most of the 20th century, the Florida legislature discussed the possibility of moving the state capital from Tallahassee to a more central location. In 1967, serious consideration was given to moving the state capital to Orlando. This inspired opponents of the move to spearhead construction of an expansive new capitol complex in Tallahassee. Looking at a map of Florida, one might wonder why Tallahassee was named the capital of Florida in the first place. In the 1700s, the British had named St. Augustine the capital of East Florida and Pensacola the capital of West Florida. When Florida became a United States territory in 1821, most of the population resided in North Florida between these 2 cities. It was decided that Florida needed one unified capital, so one person started walking from Pensacola and another from St. Augustine, and they met in Tallahassee.
Well, it's located in Tallahassee because prior to it being located in Tallahassee, Florida actually had the location of 2 different capitals, Pensacola and St. Augustine. It was very difficult for people to travel to those locations as well. So at the period of time in 1824 when the capital was picked for Tallahassee, most of Florida's population was in the northern part of the state, not in the southern part of the state. So it makes sense that they would choose a central location for that population, which was up here. But there's always been a struggle to relocate the capital to the central and southern parts of the state, basically from the selection of Tallahassee. In the 1890s, there was a big push, which is what resulted in the expansion of the building to the 1902 version, and it happened again in the 1960s. Senator Lee Weisenborn, who was from South Florida, made a push for the capital to be moved to Central or South Florida, and in response to that, there was a very powerful group of legislators up here in the north who said that that was not going to happen. And not only were they going to keep the capital here, but they were going to make a big investment in the capital infrastructure at that point, which is how we got the new capital that we all know today.
What happened was that Florida was suddenly opened up in the late 1890s by the railroads. You had the 2 Henrys. Henry Plant taking his railroad down to Tampa Bay. You had Henry Flagler taking his railroad from St. Augustine down to Palm Beach and ultimately into Miami. In fact, interestingly, one of my grandfathers helped vote for the incorporation of the city of Miami in 1896. But that suddenly opened up the peninsula. Before that, Florida was just the old South, a band of about 60 to 90 miles along the southern Georgia and Alabama border. And below that, there were Seminole Indians, military forts, a few straggling settlers and things like that, but basically swamps, mosquitoes, and no one wanted to live there.
The biggest thing that was happening was that Florida's population was growing very fast. As we all know, we had a big boom in the 20s and then a bust. And after World War II, we had the population just continuing to grow and grow and grow. the population was filling in Central Florida and South Florida, where historically in the 19th century, everybody had lived within 50 miles of Georgia or Alabama. And the problem was that the Constitution that we were under in mid-20th century Florida was an 1885 Constitution. And it had provided for a legislative apportionment scheme that was perfect for 1885. It had most of the districts. They were geographically small and had small populations, and they were mostly in northern Florida. As the population grows, everyone's going to Central Florida, South Florida, and the beach, and there's not many legislative districts left over down there. So you end up with very large populations of people in places like Dade County, and they have almost no or very little representation because of the strictures of the 1885 Constitution.
It's a constitutional question which dealt with the composition of the Florida legislature. The old 1885 Constitution basically gave every county at least one state representative, and we have 67 counties. Some of them are really tiny. And then it capped the number of legislators that a large county had. So end up in the 1960s, Florida had the most malapportioned state legislature in the country. Such a few number of Floridians could basically elect a majority or controlling interest in the Florida legislature, rural and North Florida. Well, the Supreme Court ruled one man, one vote applied to state legislators, and so we had to enact a new constitution in 1968. And the old pork chop gang, primarily located in North Florida, suddenly realized that all of these large urban centers, counties in South and Central Florida would suddenly gain control. And there was a movement, one state senator introduced a resolution to move the capital from Tallahassee to Orlando to be more central. And they suddenly realized, my gosh, this can happen. So suddenly it became a mad rush by the northern pork chop and rural senators and legislators to build a brand new Capitol building for Florida, because they felt that once the concrete and steel was in the ground, no one would ever move it from North Florida and Tallahassee. So that was the impetus for the new Capitol building.
A group that became known as the Pork Chop Gang, which was a group of rural, mostly northern, rural senators that actually took an oath to vote together in a block to support the Southern way of life. They saw their state being changed, being filled in, being urbanized, being populated with people who were not Southerners. They didn't share their values. They were Cuban, Jewish, Northern. They were all kinds of things that were not what the group in charge was comfortable with. And so they felt that to defend and preserve the way of life that they valued, they needed to hold on to that. And so that was another reason that they held on to the apportionment scheme the way it was.
As the populations of South Florida and Central Florida continued to grow, it became much more difficult for the Pork Chop Gang to retain control in Tallahassee.
The constitutional scheme, apportionment scheme, said that no county could have more than 3 representatives, and every county got 1. So imagine Liberty County in the far panhandle had, now I don't know, but I'm going to guess maybe 2,000 people. It got a representative. Dade County had 500,000 people. It got 3. So that was the nature of the lack of power. Southern Florida needed roads. It needed hospitals. It needed prisons. Maybe it wanted some tourist development dollars that might come from the state. There was just no interest in allocating things like that to really any part of the state, because of course northern Florida didn't have that, didn't want it, and didn't need it.
The Pork Chop Gang saw their power threatened, but thought that they could at least keep the Capitol in Tallahassee if they built an expensive new Capitol building there. In their zeal to build a new Capitol, they decided to tear down the old Capitol building. As Secretary of State, Bruce Smathers led an uphill battle to save the historic state capitol.
So we actually felt, hey, we would lose. But the idea 40 years from now or 50 years from now, when people look back, at least they'll know that when we lost the Capitol, we went down fighting. It's sort of like I was out of the Navy and I was going to go down with the ship and with all guns firing. And our strategy basically was initially just to delay and delay and delay and try to build up support. There was lots of support from historical groups around the state. Florida doesn't have a lot of history except in the colonial past. But we had the 5th oldest state capitol building in continuing use in the United States, dating back to 1845 because the interior walls were there as it expanded. And unlike Texas, which maintained their historic capitol building by building their new offices, et cetera, underground, the decision was made because it was on a hill to build the new capitol right next to the old capitol. And as the new capitol was finished, they would move in and they would tear down, ultimately, when the executive tower, the 22-story executive tower was finished, they would tear down the whole capitol building or rebuild an 1845 structure. Governor Askew wanted a fountain. He wanted it totally removed.
The proponents of destroying the historic Capitol building claimed that it was unsafe, in danger of collapsing, and a fire hazard. In a dramatic gesture to demonstrate that these claims were untrue, Smathers refused to move out of the building when the new Capitol was completed.
When the executive tower was finished and the governor and the cabinet finally moved out, I stayed on because I just wanted to demonstrate that, according to the Corps of Engineers and our own studies, the state historic capitol building was perfectly sound. And the way to do it was saying, hey, wait a second, we are going to stay here because we're not concerned about it. And that, of course, was a PR stunt in many respects, but we're in a political fight, and we just had to make a point that all the reasons that everybody had said the historic state capitol building had to be torn down were false. And by staying there, of course, the governor didn't stand by, and he got the fire marshal, the insurance commissioner fire marshal, Bill Gunner, and Bill always has felt bad about this. But in fact, with so few people in the historic capitol building, if a fire had broken out in another part of the building, it could have spread, and then before anybody knew anything about it, because there were not the necessary fire alarms and things like that, which could have been provided, but the governor wasn't going to do that. And so he finally said, yes, if you stay there as you are now, that would create a threat to your employees. And with that, we had to move into the new Capitol building. But the point had been made. And by that time, even Don Tucker, the Speaker of the House, was told by his colleagues, hey, you can't tear it down. And the 1902 Capitol building, which is a magnificent structure, a beautiful structure, they agreed that our proposal was what needed to be done. And so we were surprisingly successful, even though when we first started off, we didn't think we had a chance.
Bruce had been elected as Secretary of State, and as that, he was somewhat the historical protector of Florida. And the original proposal for the new Capitol called for the old Capitol to be leveled and a park in front of the new Capitol. Bruce objected to the loss of that linkage of history because the Florida Capitol had been on that site at least since the 1820s, when Florida was still a territory and Andrew Jackson selected Tallahassee to be its capital. And so there was tremendous amount of emotional connection with that building and with the evolution of Florida into the modern state that it had become. And Bruce led the effort, and I'm pleased that he was successful.
It takes more than 4 hours to get to Tallahassee from Orlando, and even longer, of course, from South Florida, but seeing the Florida Historic Capitol Museum is worth the drive. You've been watching Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. Visit us anytime on the web at myfloridahistory.org. Thanks for joining us. I'm Ben Broekmarkel. The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
Florida's Space Coast Office of Tourism, representing destinations from Titusville to Cocoa Beach to Melbourne Beach. The Space Coast has a diverse 72 miles of beach, including surf towns and sea turtle nests. We have inspiring attractions, including the Kennedy Space Center, Brevard Museum of History and Natural Science, and the Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge. More information is available at www.visitspacecoast.com.
and by the Department of State Division of Cultural Affairs, the Florida Council of Arts and Culture, and the state of Florida.